Welcome to this very important, relevant, and urgent session of the International Lecture Scene series. We can't keep up with the developments these days. For those of you who don't know, I'm Linda Longmire. I'm one of the co-directors of the International Scene Lecture Series. And thanks to all of you for coming again at this very urgent time where understanding foreign affairs has never been more relevant and, again, urgent. So we are delighted to welcome our guests back to Hofstra, but before that, I want to mention a couple of other things that are coming up that will be of relevance. And next, actually March 11th on Tuesday, from 1 to 2:25, we'll have, again, a kind of follow-up on this discussion when Phyllis Bennis returns, and she will talk specifically about Middle East policy and what's ahead. So please come to that. She's always important, fascinating, provocative, insightful, and then we'll also have some of our own local talent there for the discussion. So please do come to that. Again, that's at 1 o'clock, however, here, Tuesday, March 11th. This is also, of course, Women's History Month, and there is a plethora of events going on campus dealing with women's issues, both near and far, both long ago and most immediate ones today. So please grab some flyers and take a look at some of those. There's, just to give you one sampling, there's an interesting one on Jewish women fighting for social justice on both sides of the Mediterranean. Again, very interesting, but an array of events, talks, panels, discussions that we are doing. And again, in that spirit, you know, it's important because I know sometimes issues arise about, well, what about other points of view? What about diverse points of view? What about an alternative point of view? So wanted to just mention that, you know, we consider the whole campus and the whole semester full of diverse opinions and reactions and speakers and events. So, you know, obviously in any one event, it's not possible to have all points of view. So do hope that's understood, and do look around because we have, as I say, an array of events, we think expressing a wide array of opinion about foreign affairs, foreign policy issues. Today, we are so delighted to welcome back, as I say, particularly in these urgent and dramatic times, Aaron Maté, who has been here before, but today he's going to focus on the new administration, again, the sort of daily events that it's hard to keep up with, and talk about what that means, a new foreign policy, an inverted foreign policy, he will help us untangle some of these complexities as we look not only at, he'll focus on Ukraine and perhaps a bit about Gaza, but, you know, the array is enormous. Look what's going on in Sudan, which we tend to ignore or not see as critical as it is. So we are really grateful. He is a journalist and has, some of you may know his work from the Grayzone and other venues, other outlets. He's been on Democracy Now!, the Real News Network, just an array of things, Jazeera. Again, grappling with some of these big issues, but we're grateful to have his perspective because it is critical, creative, but also positive, hopeful, and I think helps us guide our way through this entangled forest of problems that we are all facing as global citizens and as Americans today. So please join me in welcoming back Aaron Maté. And just a point of information, Aaron will talk for about up to half hour maybe, and then we will open things up for your questions and comments. As always, there's a mic in the aisle. Students, tuition-paying students first, but we look forward to an energetic dialogue. Thank you, Aaron, for being here.
First time at a podium, I think. This is exciting for me. Thanks for having me back. Do I have this right? Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here. I'm very honored to be in your presence and the opportunity to discuss some critical topics. as we just heard, there are so many important issues going on in the world where the U.S. plays such an integral role. I'm not going to get to all of them. I'm going to get to the two that I focus on that I do think are pretty important. The situation in Israel-Palestine and also the war in Ukraine, where we are seeing some, I think, some really seismic events. I'm going to start, though, with Palestine, because I think that should be the top story right now. And why do I say that? Israel has just announced a new blockade, a reimposition of a blockade of all goods into Gaza. That includes food and medicine. They've exempted water, but because they've also destroyed so much of Gaza's infrastructure and control the power supply that gets into Gaza, the very limited supply, the water desalination plant in the north of Gaza has been severely curtailed, meaning that an already dire situation when it comes to water is about to get even worse. And this is critical to Americans because none of this could happen without U.S. support. The U.S. is Israel's largest patron. At the UN every single year, there are measures calling on Israel to comply with international law, which the U.S. votes against and vetoes at the UN Security Council. And the weaponry that Israel used to destroy Gaza and leave it in ruins, along with areas of Lebanon as well, was supplied almost entirely by the U.S. And this has continued under the Trump administration. Just this weekend, right before Israel announced this new blockade of Gaza, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio invoked his emergency authorities to bypass Congress and push through another $4 billion in weapons sales to Israel. What I find striking about that is I don't think Congress would even prevent the Trump administration from sending weapons to Israel, but to show the commitment we have to this foreign state and the fact that it has carte blanche to commit what I think is plausibly genocide, the Trump administration invoked its emergency powers to ignore Congress, not even get a rubber stamp for what I'm sure would already be approved. The holdup now, or the issue now when it comes to Israel-Palestine, is the next phase of the ceasefire. We're now officially at the end of the first phase of the ceasefire. During this time, about 33 Israeli hostages inside Gaza were freed, along with hundreds of Palestinian prisoners inside Israeli prisons. But now Israel is trying to impose new terms. At this point now, we're supposed to move on to phase 2. Phase 1 was just about allowing in more humanitarian aid and freeing prisoners on both sides. Phase 2 now is about a deeper Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and dismantling some of the Israeli military infrastructure that they've developed there. Israel, in a bid to stall that, is now insisting that the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire be extended indefinitely, during which Hamas releases more hostages. But Hamas sees this as an effort to avoid Israel's commitments under the second phase and take away the one point of leverage that Hamas has, which is the remaining Israeli captives, which is about 27, I think, at this point. And so now we have a new standoff, and we have new Israeli threats of renewing the horrific bombardment of this besieged death camp. The important thing to stress, especially as we talk about the cutoff of humanitarian aid, in conflicts like Sudan and the Congo, you can argue that when you have starvation, even famine, in some of these horrible crises, that some of that is attributed to environmental factors. It's hard to get aid into certain areas. In Gaza, there's no such controversy whatsoever. This is a besieged, tiny enclave surrounded on all sides. It's got Egypt on one side and Israel on the other. And there, the logistical issues with getting in aid are entirely human-created, namely the Israeli blockade. And this is a blockade that long predates the events of October 7th. For years, Israel's controlled what gets in and out of the Gaza Strip. So let me quote to you from the Israeli journalist Amira Haas. She was writing this in 2010 and writing this about the Israeli authority that controls the Gaza Strip. She writes this: "The ban on toilet paper, diapers, and sanitary napkins was lifted 3 months ago. A little more than a month ago, following a long ban, Israel permitted the import of detergents and soaps into Gaza. Even shampoo was allowed. But one merchant discovered that the bottles of shampoo he had ordered were sent back because they included conditioner, which was not on the list. 5 weeks ago, Israel allowed margarine, salt, and artificial sweetener to be brought into Gaza. Legumes have been allowed for the past 2 months, and yeast for the past 2 weeks. Contrary to rumors, Israel has not banned sugar. The Israeli authority commented that, quote, the policy on bringing in commodities derives from and is coordinated with Israel's policy towards the Gaza Strip. So my point there is simply that the pretext here of October 7th and of Israel's supposed security concerns is not applicable because this ban has long predated October 7th. And of course, what is missing from discussion of the Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip is that it's a war crime. You cannot intentionally deprive basic humanitarian goods to a civilian population. And as we saw after the ceasefire went into effect in January, immediately after the ceasefire went into effect, hundreds more trucks every single day were getting into Gaza, which just showed that the entire time the problem was not Hamas, the problem was not logistics, it was simply a human policy of starving a civilian population. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, known as the IPC, which is derived from a contribution of many global agencies, including the UN and USAID, they issued an unprecedented warning last year. They said this on 8th November, there is a strong likelihood that famine is imminent in areas within the northern Gaza Strip. 4 days later, USAID, which was then under the control of the Biden administration, promised to collaborate with the IPC and come up with a new famine assessment. And they published this warning on December 23rd. Gaza Strip food security alert. A famine scenario continues to unfold in northern Gaza. And a senior USAID official commented that that the report should be highlighted, that there is a risk of famine, but the people drafting the report refused to back down, saying, no, you have a famine scenario that continues to unfold. Well, what happened next? The Biden administration, in its last days in office, censored this report, took it offline, and insisted that they were facilitating the entry of AID. The U.S. Ambassador Jack Lew, the last ambassador under Joe Biden to Israel, he made sure that that report was suppressed. This is in violation of the ruling from the International Court of Justice just last year, which called on Israel to ensure without delay, in full cooperation with the UN, the unhindered provision at scale of basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food, water, electricity, fuel, shelter, clothing, hygiene, and sanitation requirements, as well as medical supplies and medical care. Well, Israel is once again ignoring that ruling. And now the question is, will there be any pressure put on it by the world to stop this blockade and stop its apparent effort to relaunch a war by refusing to move on to phase 2 of the ceasefire? Well, again, the determining factor here will be the U.S. government. We saw what happens when the U.S. applies its leverage. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, flew to Israel before even the Trump administration took office and told Israel basically, we want a ceasefire by the time Trump takes office. Now, Trump, I imagine, didn't want to have his inauguration celebration distracted by ongoing carnage in Gaza. Whatever his motive was, it's a good thing, I think, if the U.S. is using its leverage to stop a slaughter and to compel the delivery of basic humanitarian aid. Well, now Trump is in office, and the question is, what will he do? And I don't know the answer to that question. I do not. I do know that that Trump has bragged before about doing things on behalf of his donors, like Miriam Adelson, the casino billionaire who gave his campaign over $100 million. And he's bragged before that basically for the Adelson family, he recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, which belonged to Syria, and he also moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. So will he give them another gift? We will see. But the point is, whenever the U.S. decides to use its leverage on its clients, especially Israel, things happen, including a ceasefire. Trump's also been talking recently, and this should be addressed, about the U.S. taking over the Gaza Strip. And most of you probably saw this AI video that he released last week of his vision of a Trump Gaza, in which him and Elon Musk and Benjamin Netanyahu party on the beaches of Gaza with big hotels and golden statues of Trump in the Gaza Strip as part of his grand vision for Gaza. Now, Trump's defenders, and even some of his critics too, have said, well, all right, this is obviously outlandish, but what are the alternatives? Why aren't the Arab states coming up with their own proposals? And this is a line adopted pretty much across the political spectrum. Well, actually, there is another proposal from the Arab states, and it's been on the table for decades now. In 2002, the Arab League offered Israel full normalization if Israel simply obeyed international law, withdrew from the West Bank and Gaza, and allowed for the creation of a Palestinian state there. For Palestinians, that's a major compromise. That's asking Palestinians to basically accept just 22% of their historic homeland and to basically give up their dream of returning to their homes, because hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees were expelled when Israel was founded in 1948 and have never been allowed to return. So this compromise, accepted by the Arab League, proposed by the Arab League, accepted by the Palestinian leadership, to Israel, simply said, if you give up the West Bank and Gaza, which is 22% of Palestinians' homeland, we'll give you full normalization. That was the offer on the table formally as early as 2002, and even earlier, informally, it's been floated to Israel in other ways. Well, Israel has been so contemptuous of this proposal that Netanyahu said he won't even discuss it. It won't even be discussed. And why is that? Because Netanyahu wants to hold on to the major West Bank settlement blocks where you have hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers, people like myself, coming from places like where I live, Brooklyn, and laying claim to land that Palestinians have lived on for hundreds upon hundreds of years. And those West Bank settlement blocks make a Palestinian state, even in the tiny strip of land that Palestinians have accepted of the West Bank, that makes a Palestinian state impossible. And the Israeli government, backed up by the U.S., is so committed to hegemony that they won't even accept that major Palestinian compromise. That proposal, by the way, was also endorsed by Iran at a 2017 summit of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. Iran signed on to a measure calling for a two-state solution with East Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Palestine. So even Iran has been more accommodating on what the whole world sees as the only reasonable solution to this crisis than Israel and the U.S. has. And that is another case where if U.S. policy would change, if the U.S. would stop blocking the international consensus, this Palestinian compromise, we could see a change. Why won't we see a change? Because both parties in this country refuse to join the international consensus. We saw under Joe Biden unfettered support for Israel. We're seeing now under Trump a ceasefire so far, but rhetorically, even more fervent support for Israel. And in fact, just today, Trump on social media announced that students engaging in illegal protest at campuses like this will be deported if they're foreign students. He didn't specify what kind of illegal protest, but it's obvious what he's talking about. He's talking about anti-genocide protests of the kind that swept campuses last year and that anger people like Trump and other supporters of Israel, because you can't tolerate that moral courage, especially on college campuses, where there's a long history, a long, proud history of opposing injustice. So that's Trump on Palestine. It's grim, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Will he continue the policy of enabling Israeli aggression, or will he, as he did before taking office, perhaps see some political benefit in pushing his client Israel to adhere to its own ceasefire rather than imposing new terms? That's Israel, Palestine. A lot more to say, but that's where I'll leave it for now. We can return to it. Now, meanwhile, in Ukraine, we have another case where actually Trump is using overwhelming U.S. leverage, and I think it's achieving a positive result. Trump has just announced that he's pausing weapons to Ukraine. Now, is Trump doing this for principled reasons? Is he a pacifist? Does he love peace? No. Zelensky bothered him at the White House the other day when they got into a confrontation. Now, the mainstream narrative there is that Trump and J.D. Vance ambushed Zelensky and treated him horribly and are throwing our key ally under the bus and siding with our enemy inside Russia, Vladimir Putin. I don't quite see it that way. I do think they were rude to Zelensky. For example, J.D. Vance badgering Zelensky to be more he said, so have you said thank you once today? Have you said thank you? Zelensky does say thank you a lot because he's gotten a lot of money from the U.S. So much, in fact, that he recently said half of it is missing. That's how much money Ukraine's gotten from the U.S., that they can't even find all of it because there's just so much of it. So I thought that was insensitive of J.D. Vance. Also because what does Ukraine have to thank the U.S. for? Ukraine's being used, as the Biden administration admitted, for a goal of bleeding Russia. That is now the open secret that is not even concealed anymore. For a while during the initial stages of the Ukraine war, the line was we're defending democracy, we're stopping authoritarianism. But just yesterday on CNN, Congressmember Eric Swalwell gave what I thought was a really honest answer. He said that this proxy war has been wonderful because it's, quote, decimated Russia's military and economy. And he added that this is, quote, the greatest return on investment for any military expenditure ever. And as far as the return on investment for soldiers' lives, it's infinity because you can't divide zero. So what he means is we haven't lost a single American soldier inside Ukraine. So our return on investment is infinity because since zero of our soldiers have died, the investment is unbelievable because we're weakening our biggest ally and hurting their economy without sacrificing any soldiers. The problem there is he left out an army that's being sacrificed. That's the Ukrainian army. Hundreds of thousands of people have died so that Eric Swalwell can sit in Washington and brag that we're decimating a foreign country's military and economy. Did Ukrainian families sign up to be sacrificed on behalf of U.S. geopolitical aims? I don't think so. That's not why people, I think, join armies, to serve a foreign power's hegemonic goals. And it speaks to the fact that he can brag about how no U.S. soldiers have died while omitting that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have died. It speaks to the contempt that our governing elite have for Ukrainians and being willing to use them not to defend Ukraine, but to weaken Russia, to bleed Russia, which has been what this war has all been about. So given that that's the goal of the U.S., I don't think it's right for Zelensky to be told to thank the U.S. for having his country exploited for a proxy war. But I don't think it was J.D. Vance's rudeness that caused this meltdown. If you watch the White House meeting, before J.D. Vance made that comment, the meeting went on for about 40 minutes. It was pretty cordial. Trump even said we're going to continue to arm Ukraine. When Zelensky called Putin a terrorist and a killer, Trump didn't object and try to argue with him. The problem is Zelensky, though, kept saying he wouldn't make any compromises. He said at one point, there's no compromises with that killer. And he also kept saying, we want security guarantees, which the Trump administration does not want to provide Ukraine, because especially in a time of war, a security guarantee for Ukraine means the U.S. is at war with Russia. So finally, when J.D. Vance talked about how the key to prosperity is engaging in diplomacy, that's when Zelensky snapped and he confronted J.D. Vance directly. He said, what kind of diplomacy are you talking about, J.D.? And he challenged him. And that was a revealing exchange, because Zelensky basically tried to argue that you can't negotiate with Putin. And the examples he gave, I think, are important to examine, because they speak to, I think, the fact that you can actually engage with Russia if you're interested not in a proxy war, but in genuine peace and security for everybody. So Zelensky, in making his case to Trump and Vance, he invoked an agreement that was reached between himself and Putin back in December 2019. And one of the provisions of this agreement, which was reached in Paris, brokered by Germany and France, called for the exchange of prisoners. And this is what Zelensky told J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. He said, Putin didn't engage prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. Well, that's just not true. Later on that month, Zelensky himself attended a welcome home ceremony of Ukrainian prisoners who were freed under that deal. And the following April 2020, there was another round of prisoners that were released. So what Zelensky said there is not true. Now, another major component of that deal that he invoked, that he claimed that Putin broke, was that both sides agreed to recommit to the Minsk Accords. And the Minsk Accords was a pact finalized in February 2015, which was aimed at ending a war that had begun the year prior. In February 2014, you had the overthrow of a Ukrainian president named Yanukovych, who was very corrupt, but that's not why the U.S. didn't like him. The U.S. didn't like him because he was promising neutrality. He was promising not to join NATO. Now, this happened to be in line with the majority of public opinion in Ukraine, and also in line with Ukraine's declaration of state sovereignty, which called for Ukraine to be a neutral country. And that makes sense, I think, mainly because you have a very divided country inside of Ukraine. You have people in the west of Ukraine mostly who hate Russia, who hate the ethnic Russian component of Ukraine. There are millions of them in the east. And you have people in the east who identify with Russia and actually consider themselves to be ethnic Russian. So in a country that is so polarized, it makes no sense to me, especially if it's on Russia's border, to push it into a military alliance that has many other members that are very hostile to Russia. It's a recipe for disaster. I think it's a very reasonable solution in that situation to have neutrality, and that's why Ukraine's own declaration of state sovereignty enshrined neutrality as a goal, and that's why for many years public opinion in Ukraine supported neutrality. But that was not to the favor of Washington neoconservatives who have made pulling Ukraine into NATO their goal. It was first enshrined by the Bush administration when, back in 2008, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney overruled even their advisors. Even someone like Condoleezza Rice, who was no peacenik, said, this is not a good idea. They ignored them and said, let's bring Ukraine into NATO. And they passed that invitation at a NATO summit in April 2008. So finally, in 2013, you had a President Yanukovych who was about to, basically make it official that Ukraine would not join NATO. And lo and behold, a protest movement props up with genuine concerns about Yanukovych's corruption and people wanting more ties to the West. But that was exploited by the U.S., who poured a lot of money into supporting protest groups and encouraging what amounted to regime change, to the point where even a power-sharing agreement that was aimed at resolving that whole crisis, called the Maidan crisis, was sabotaged by elements of Ukraine's far right. And the U.S., after initially supporting that power-sharing agreement that would have left that President Yanukovych in power, pretty much forgot about that. And the extent of the U.S. involvement in this was confirmed when there was a leaked phone call of Victoria Nuland, a senior official under Biden, in which she was caught plotting with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine who should be the Ukrainian politicians coming into the new government. And Victoria Nuland was heard saying, Klitschko, he's not the guy, he should be on the outside. And they settled on a guy named Yatsenyuk, who, lo and behold, became the new president of the new prime minister of Ukraine after the coup happened. So anyway, after you have a war, so after the coup, you had a war break out in between the new coup government and Eastern Ukrainians backed by Russia. And then you have the Minsk Accords, which is aimed at resolving that war and putting it to an end. And this December 2019 agreement that Zelensky invoked was supposed to recommit both sides, Ukraine and Russia, to the Minsk Accords. Well, what happened there? Initially, Zelensky took some positive steps towards implementation. But then he started to receive threats from Ukraine's ultra-nationalists, people who identify with a figure named Stefan Bandera, who was a Nazi collaborator during the Second World War. And they were very opposed to any kind of accommodation with Russia and the Eastern Ukrainians that Russia supported. And so Zelensky started to change his tune. In mid-July 2020, Zelensky's party proposed a measure that would undermine a key provision of Minsk, which was that there be local elections in eastern Ukraine, the parts of the Donbass where Russia was backing rebels, which under Minsk was supposed to have some limited autonomy. And Zelensky, after initially backing that, backed off. And he even said, the people of the Donbass have been brainwashed. They live in the Russian information space. I can't reach them. So that was Zelensky signaling that rather than trying to reach out to these Eastern Ukrainians who had rebelled against a coup back in 2014 and trying to address their concerns, he had concluded that all of them were simply just Russian dupes and tools of Russia. When Biden took office in January 2021, Zelensky got even more confrontational. So Biden takes office January 2021. The following month, Zelensky bans 3 opposition television networks, all of whom favor closer ties to Russia. And they're owned by someone who's very close to Vladimir Putin. This was before, by the way, a year before Russia invaded. So you can't have the excuse there that, we're at a time of war, we have to crack down on the media because of our security. This was a year before Russia invaded. And an aide to Zelensky later disclosed that this crackdown on these opposition television networks that favored friendly ties with Russia, it was, quote, conceived as a welcome gift to the Biden administration. And the Biden administration applauded this welcome gift. It praised Zelensky's censorship, and it rewarded him with a new military package of $125 million. Excuse me. It was then that Zelensky got even more bellicose. He talked about retaking the Donbass, the eastern Ukrainian territory, which had been rebelling against his government by force rather than negotiations. And he even said this: "I have no intention of talking to terrorists. It's just impossible for me in my position." He also started demanding changes to the Minsk Accords, the pact that he agreed to implement back in December 2019 with Putin. He said, "I'm now participating in the process that was designed before my time. The Minsk process should be more flexible in the situation. It should serve the purposes of today, not the past." So even though Zelensky had signed on to Minsk, even though the UN Security Council had endorsed Minsk, Zelensky was now demanding that it be changed. And basically what he didn't want to do was grant the eastern parts of Ukraine the limited autonomy that they were supposed to enjoy under the Minsk Accords. That was his main problem with it. And right up until Russia's invasion, his stance hardened to the point where his top security chief said right before Russia invaded, "The fulfillment of the Minsk agreement means the country's destruction." Well, I would argue the opposite. Refusing to implement the Minsk Accords, refusing to recognize the autonomy of Eastern Ukrainians who had rebelled in 2014 against the overthrow of the president they supported, that has led to the country's destruction. Because shortly after that quote was said, Russia invaded. And what was the goal of Russia's invasion? The conventional narrative is that it was done to destroy Ukraine as a country, wipe it off the map. But look what happened right after Russia invaded. The two sides immediately began negotiating. And Putin later said, and I think this is right, that the goal of the invasion was to compel Ukraine into negotiations that it pretty much had been ignoring before. And that's why we can, even if you don't want to take Putin's word, what did these negotiations lead to? The Istanbul Accords of April 2022, when Ukraine and Russia came close to reaching a deal that would have ended the Russian invasion and prevented hundreds of thousands of deaths. Let me quote to you a member of Zelensky's own negotiating team, Alexander Chali, who was a senior member of the Ukrainian negotiating team. He said, quote, "We managed to find our very real compromise. We were very close in the middle of April to finalize our war with some peaceful settlement." And he added, Putin tried to do everything possible to conclude an agreement with Ukraine. Well, what happened to that agreement? We know now that Boris Johnson, then the British Prime Minister, came over to Zelensky. He visited him and said, "We're not going to back you up on this. You want a security guarantee from us to make peace with Russia. We're not going to give it to you. You should keep fighting instead. We think you can win, and you should not give up anything, and we're going to flood you with weapons, and we're not going to back you up." And Victoria Nuland, the aforementioned Victoria Nuland, a senior Biden administration official, later confirmed that she gave a similar message. So it was the US and the UK that stood alone in refusing to support this peace deal that Ukrainians had reached. This wasn't just Russia imposing this. Ukrainians had agreed to this in what one of their own negotiators called a very real compromise. Well, what is the result since that deal was sabotaged? Hundreds of thousands of dead, and Ukraine now in a much worse position, where with Trump now in power, it looks like they'll be forced to accept a much worse agreement. And Trump has left them in an even worse position because he just currently now paused weapons to Ukraine, meaning that Ukraine's being cut off from its key military supporter unless things change. Now, in fairness to Zelensky, this was not just because he is, I think, a belligerent person. I do think initially he tried to make peace. He tried to fulfill the steps he was obligated to take under Minsk. But he's faced threats from within, and his main backer in Washington has refused to stand up for him. And that threat has come from the aforementioned far-right ultranationalist movement inside Ukraine, which is small in size, but it's very large in power. Very well-organized militias, very well-armed. And they've repeatedly over the years used the threat of intimidation, the threat of violence to get what they want. So, for example, the Combating Terrorism Center at the West Point Military Academy, they wrote a report a few years ago on far-right extremists inside Ukraine. And they say this about these ultra-nationalist groups, that they remain strong in Ukraine with the ability to marshal thousands of supporters for protests and rallies, some of whom carry Nazi and white supremacist insignia. These groups have bitterly opposed any suggestion of compromise with Russia over Donbass through the Normandy negotiating process. Now, when Zelensky was elected in May 2019, he talked about being the president of peace. He said, I was elected on a peace mandate, which is true. People from all sides of the conflict in Ukraine voted for him because he was promising to make peace. And he said, I'm even willing to lose my popularity and my position if we can make peace. But this is how one prominent far-right ultranationalist leader responded. He said this. His name is Dmytro Yarosh, commander of something called the Right Sector, which is a far-right hate group. He said this. Zelensky said he was ready to lose his ratings, popularity, position. No, he would lose his life. He will hang on some tree in Kyiv if he betrays Ukraine and those people who died in the Maidan Revolution and the Donbass War. Now, amazingly, despite threatening the president of the country, Yarosh was subsequently named as an advisor to the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces. That speaks to the influence that these far-right ultranationalist forces, despite how small they are in size, have inside of Ukraine. Andrei Beletsky, the leader of a group called the Azov Battalion, which is prior to Russia's invasion, you could read in the U.S. media that they were a neo-Nazi group. New York Times, The Guardian, Azov is neo-Nazi. After Russia invaded, we all had to forget about that. And all of a sudden now they're a nationalist group, or even just a beloved group inside Ukraine. They've been whitewashed, but we used to refer to them accurately as neo-Nazis because that's what Andrei Beletsky is. And he said this, if Zelensky continues the course of legitimizing the rebel territories, introducing them into the Ukrainian legislative field and the constitution of our country, or even tries to open the water to Crimea, which is the territory that Russia annexed in 2014, then I will 100% agree he really should leave. Now, the problem here is that this was not just confined to far-right groups in Ukraine. This also was the dominant position in Washington. So William Taylor, who was the top U.S. envoy back in 2019, he later bragged that he had told Zelensky to forget about Minsk. It was a terrible idea. Don't do it. And this speaks to the fact that Zelensky had no real authority to fulfill his mandate of peace. When you have the far right in Ukraine threatening his life, and you have Washington as main sponsor not helping him out, not backing him up, then he lacked the political will, the political power, the political capital to push this through. Somebody who recognized this was the late Stephen F. Cohen, a prominent scholar here in the U.S. He taught at Princeton and NYU, a mentor of mine. And back in October 2019, I spoke to him, and he issued a warning. He said that Zelensky will not be able to go forward with the full peace negotiations unless America has his back. And the reason why, he said, is because a quasi-fascist movement in Ukraine is threatening his life. We haven't had Zelensky's back when it comes to his peace mandate. We've instead told him to keep fighting, keep sacrificing his forces, and for that, you're going to get rewarded with a lot of money and military equipment, some of which can be siphoned off for corruption. And you'll be rewarded by being presented as the next, Winston Churchill, standing ovations in Congress, being named the Time Person of the Year. And Zelensky, I think, has unfortunately believed his own hype. And it was that entitlement, that sort of, that puffery that I think led Zelensky to snap at Vance and Trump, when finally, in a reversal of course, they encouraged the Ukraine to actually engage in diplomacy, which in fairness to Zelensky has not been the policy of the U.S. so far. So maybe it's still hard for him to process. But for whatever reason, that is the policy that Trump and Vance are taking. We can get into why if you're interested. But the fact is, I think that whatever Trump's own personal motives are, encouraging peace, encouraging diplomacy, especially when there are real options on the table. We already have the negotiations that occurred in Istanbul a few years ago, which came very close to a deal. I think any effort towards peace, rather than continuing the bloodletting, is a welcome development. And if only that same policy were applied to the U.S.'s other client, other proxy, Israel, a lot more lives could be saved. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Lots to think about, lots of reactions, I'm sure. We have the mic open here in the center, so if people would speak to the mic, that would be great. Again, students first, and then others who might want to share.
Hi, good afternoon. You had said that the war, my first question involving like the Israeli and Palestine situation, my thing is, what do you think that the involvement of, or lack thereof involvement of other countries involving this whole thing says about not only the United Nations, but also about the United States' power as well?
So the lack of involvement of other countries?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at the Gulf states of the region. Look at, Jordan. Jordan basically took part in helping Israel carry out its attacks, and it's opened up its airspace to Israel before, and these are states that have sold out the Palestinians, even though Jordan has a majority Palestinian population. And all these states happen to have one thing in common. They're all close to the U.S. Egypt has done nothing for the Palestinians. Egypt, after Israel, is the largest recipient of U.S. military aid. Saudi Arabia has talked about how they will not engage with Israel, they will not normalize with Israel unless there's a creation of a Palestinian state. But they could do a lot more. They could do a lot more. And I think the major problem, I would take it back to the U.S. The U.S. has military bases in many of these countries, like in Qatar and in Jordan, and has a huge amount of influence, and people just don't want to defy the global godfather. I think that's what it comes down to. But certainly all these states could do a lot more. Even Turkey, which talks very tough against Israel, says all these things and, says, I think, things that are accurate, still helps facilitate energy sales to Israel. So certainly, if these states could actually get together and use their collective leverage to put pressure, I do think that would help. But ultimately, given the overwhelming power of the U.S. around the world, its military, financial power, I still think a change in Washington would be the most decisive factor.
Mm-hmm. And a follow-up, like another question about the Ukraine and Russia conflict. You had, to sum it up, you pretty much said like the invasion of Russia's invasion of Ukraine had led and had pushed more towards negotiation. Would negotiations not have been done without invasion, is my question, because I feel as if pushing that narrative, I think personally, pushing that narrative as, without the war, we wouldn't have negotiations. That was going to be a given regardless, because the point of the war is to have negotiations, but I feel as if this could have been avoided without.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm certainly not advocating the invasion. I'm just pointing out that the war did lead to negotiations. Now, does that mean that there would have been no negotiations otherwise? No, I can't predict that. But I will say, and I quoted some Ukrainian officials saying that we're not going to fulfill our obligations under the Minsk Accords, which was the internationally agreed upon framework for resolving the issue of the Donbass conflict. So from Russia's perspective, all right, if they're saying they're not going to basically engage in diplomacy, we're going to enforce that at the barrel of the gun. That was the Russian position. Does that mean that the only way to do it would have been to invade? No. And I think if you're Russia, if you're invading a country, you have to show you've exhausted all diplomatic alternatives. And I don't think Russia showed that. They could have brought this up at the UN Security Council. They could have called for peacekeepers in the Donbass. Many things they could have done to show that they had done everything they could to compel a diplomatic settlement. And they didn't. They chose to invade. And I think they thought this would be a lot quicker than it has been. And certainly there has been a lot of Ukrainian resolve in fighting Russia. A lot of people have died. And you can't do that unless people are determined. I just think that from our point of view, our role should have been to encourage diplomacy, to encourage Ukraine to follow the Minsk Accords. And had we done that, I think we could have helped avoid all the carnage that's ensued.
Hello, I just wanted to thank you for the lecture. I think you offer like a different perspective many of us are not used to hearing from. And my question is about Ukraine. And I was just wondering, you know, you display Russia as sort of being compelled, I guess, to invade Ukraine. And I'm just curious as to how come you didn't mention the Russification that's happening in the regions that Russia is currently occupying? They're switching Ukrainian signs to Russian signs. In fact, there was an ICC warrant for Putin and, I can't pronounce her name, Maria Belova, because they're, in fact, abducting Ukrainian children and putting them into Russian households. And just as a follow-up, do you believe that there is genocide currently happening in Ukraine?
No, I don't believe there's genocide happening in Ukraine. I think it's an awful war, but the majority of casualties are military on both sides. And the death toll when it comes to civilians, the last time I checked, it was about maybe 20,000 in 3 years of war, maybe even less, actually. So no, I don't think that's a genocide. I think what Israel's doing is genocide, but no. But look, my opinion on that doesn't matter. If it is genocide, then there's a court through which Ukraine can go and charge Russia, and if there's evidence, they can be found guilty of it. But no. On the Russification, yeah. Listen, the problem is, as I tried to mention, Ukraine's a very divided country. There are people inside Ukraine, and we don't hear from them very much because they go against the narrative that we're supposed to buy into, who actually do identify with Russia. Many people obviously don't identify with Russia, and they hate Russia and want nothing to do with it. But that's why my point was, in a divided country, rather than try to move people into one camp, I think you should respect that there are differences. And the answer in that situation is to have neutrality, which is what most Ukrainians have wanted going back over the years. In recent years, that's shifted since Russia invaded. And I understand why people would want to be in NATO after being invaded by a foreign country. But I think historically, given the divisions in Ukraine, it's worth to see it as not worthy. It's very dangerous to push it into one camp, which is what the U.S. has tried to do by bringing it into NATO. And so, yes, certainly has Russia been oppressive against people who don't want to be under Russian rule? Absolutely. I would never deny that. But the part I think you're missing is that the government that came to power in 2014 with U.S. help, what was one of their first moves in parliament? It was to try to basically ban the Russian language, to rule it out as being an official language. And that was a message to people inside Ukraine who consider themselves to be ethnic Russian, who speak Russian as their first language, that they're not welcome here anymore. And there have been many more messages of that sort. And they've renamed their streets, by the way, after literal Nazis, people who collaborated with the Nazis and took part in the massacres of Jews and Poles in the Second World War, which has not made some ethnic groups inside Ukraine feel very welcome. And that's why, for example, in 2013, when Victoria Nuland and John McCain and Chris Murphy went over and were cavorting around with some of the leaders of the Maidan Revolution, which led to the coup, one of the people that they were appearing with was a founder of a group called Svoboda, who 1 year earlier, the European Union had said, we don't encourage people to affiliate with Svoboda because they're a xenophobic, racist hate group. And that's the kind of people that the U.S. has empowered inside of Ukraine over, I think, the wishes of the majority of the population. And that's who's also, I think, intimidated Zelensky into not following through on his peace mandate.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can bring this down a bit. No, excuse me.
It's all right.
So really, I have I guess 3 questions. So the first is regarding the Middle East. So how you were mentioning how, I guess how Trump was deporting these protesters who were trying to address that there was genocide in the Middle East, and then why would he really allow that, since especially in the Constitution, in the First Amendment, how it allows people to have the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly. Do you have an idea why he would really allow that? Why would he deport people who are just addressing their feelings on a major human rights violation that's occurring in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, you think if he cared about principles, he would adopt that position, but I don't think he does. And look what happened at these major universities. Some of the most prestigious universities in the country last year, their presidents were fired. Why? Because powerful donors who support Israel wanted them gone because in their view they weren't sufficiently cracking down on free speech. So there's a free speech exemption in this country. Palestine isn't the only issue, but it's, I think, the most egregious one where just free speech rights are not respected if you're saying the wrong thing.
Right. And then for my second question regarding Ukraine, so, because really, for Ukraine to really guarantee security, like really the best way was to join NATO, but instead Trump is trying to get like this mineral deal in Ukraine for like a compromise. So why would we not decide to like really assist Ukraine in trying to join NATO, since that's what both countries really want, what the US want and what Ukraine wants, instead of focusing on some like mineral deal compromise?
Let me put a question to you. What if Mexico wanted to join a military alliance led by Russia and China? Would you consider that to be like something in the interest of everyone's security?
Touche.
Okay, so exactly. So that's why, because especially in a very divided country, there's a very famous cable written by William Burns, who was most recently the director of the CIA. But under George W. Bush, he was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. And right as Bush was pushing through NATO in Ukraine, Burns wrote a very famous memo called Niet. Niet means Niet. No means no. And what he was saying was that everybody in Russia, even the people who hate Putin, hate his guts, they all say that no one favors NATO in Ukraine because they all see this as a huge threat to them. Because what if, for example, and this was back in 2008, what if he says that there's a civil war between the competing sides in Ukraine, the pro-Russian side and the pro-Western side, and Russia is going to feel compelled to intervene. And if NATO intervenes, we have a World War III and everyone gets blown up. So why would we want to have that? And so that's why I think it just makes sense to respect neutrality. And the best security guarantee Ukraine could get would be from Russia, because that's the biggest threat to Ukraine. It's right there on its borders. And a point that Barack Obama made when he was president, when people were pushed inside his own cabinet, everybody was pushing Obama to do a lot more than he did, and he didn't want to. He said, because listen, whatever we do militarily, forget the principle, Russia can do a lot more, because they're right there on Ukraine's border. They're a much more powerful country. So why would we play that military game when even when it comes to the balance of forces, we'll lose every time? It's a recipe for Ukraine's destruction. So Ukraine, its best security guarantee would be what it almost achieved a few years ago when it negotiated with Russia directly. They were very close to a deal. They wanted some support from the US and UK, and the US didn't back them up. And why not? It's because their goal wasn't done. Their goal was to use Ukraine to bleed Russia.
And really, my final question, which I consider, I guess, probably one of the ultimate question, really, like, so kind of what you were saying about, like, with peace and then stuff, like, why, like, if we have the option to choose peace, like, over, like, fighting in war, then why can't we just try to, like, see if we can maybe find a way to, like, work together and try to just,
Yeah.
like, ultimately, like, because, like, that was the ultimate goal of the UN, to, like, also prevent another world war, yet it's most likely not that as effective as it really should be. But I feel like do you have, like, or I guess is there really any hope for potential, I guess trying to have more peace than war and see if we can, like, is there anything we can do about that? Like, how can we do that?
So two questions. Why do we often keep choosing the path of war over peace?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to figure
the reason, I think, like we have what Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address, a military-industrial complex. Makes a lot of money off of war. And also, once you have, people can relate to this. Like, once you have something to do, once you have a job, you enjoy it, it's, like you want to keep doing it. And so that's the problem. We've created this whole industry now out of making war. So for example, in the late 90s, when there was a big push to expand NATO, there was a committee in Washington called the Committee to Expand NATO. And the head of it was a guy named Bruce Jackson. And what was Bruce Jackson's day job, the head of the Committee to Expand NATO? It was a vice president at Lockheed Martin. So he would make weapons by day, And then in his spare time, he would be part of a committee lobbying the Congress to expand NATO. Because you make a lot of money when you expand NATO, because these new NATO countries have to buy your weapons. So, and let me quote you somebody. So this is James Steinberg. He was an advisor to the Clinton administration, which presided over a lot of NATO expansion. And, someone said to him, well, why did you expand NATO so much? I mean, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The whole reason for NATO was to stop the Soviet Union and defeat communism, Stalin. Okay. Even if you accept that premise, now the Soviet Union is dead. So why do we keep expanding NATO? And this is what Steinberg said. You're particularly attracted to things that you don't have to do, but that you want to do because you think it's shaping. So for him, it's kind of like a wellness thing. Like, well, this is just good for our shaping, our identity. And it gives us a reason, like a new identity. And I think that's what it is. It's just there's a lot of money, there's a lot of energy invested in warmongering, so why not continue?
All right, thank you.
Hi, I have a few questions about Ukraine and some regarding the Israel-Palestine war. So I'm going to start with Ukraine. During the initial invasion specifically, would you agree that Russia committed war crimes?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So given that, is it fair for Zelensky to fear a neutrality that once Putin has time to regroup, he would continue and invade Ukraine again?
Well, it's fair to fear that, but what's the alternative? Continuing the war and sacrificing a lot more people? Zelensky made an argument addressing some of these points when he went to Bucha, which is the site of, which I'm sure you've heard about, one of the most notorious cases of Russian war crimes. Civilians found dead, and Russia was accused of a lot of atrocities. Well, Zelensky went to Bucha, and he actually said that, that this is a reason for us to reach peace, because unless we do, we'll have more Buchas. And I agree with that. Now, the way to prevent atrocities is to make peace agreements, and if Russia breaks them, then you fight them again, and you appeal to the UN Security Council to intervene. There are means to address that. But, I'll read you what he said. He said, he was asked in Bucha, he was asked if the peace talks will continue. He said this: yes, because Ukraine must have peace. Every tragedy like this, every Bucha will affect negotiations, but we need to find opportunities for these steps. And then he said, and this is according to one of his top advisors who actually took part in the negotiations that happened in Istanbul at the same time. You guys understand that this is war. There could be many more victims, and even more terrible stories could later emerge. But if there is even one chance for us to find some kind of mechanism for ending the war, then we need to use that chance. We can't miss it. He also said that month, I don't think we have any other choice, even though we're fighting very hard. I don't see any option other than to sit down with Putin at the negotiating table and talk. So what happened there? That's the same month that later, that same month later on, Boris Johnson came to him and said, keep fighting. If you keep fighting, we'll reward you with a lot of money, a lot of adulation, and also we're not going to back you up anyway. We're not going to give you any security guarantees. So given that we're responsible for our actions, not Zelensky's actions or Putin's actions, but our actions, why were we so hostile to peace? And why wouldn't we help secure it? If the U.S. had actually given a security guarantee back then to underpin the deal, that would have been a great way to ensure peace. But we didn't do that because our goals were different. Our goal was not the defense of Ukraine. It was the weakening of Russia.
All right, so now I want to transition to the Israel-Palestine war. Regarding statehood for the Palestinian people, I agree they should have it, and it should have been done a long time ago. But would you agree that it sets a dangerous precedent giving them a state after October 7th, immediately after, might incentivize other terrorist organizations seeking statehood to launch violent massacres against other states?
Well, by that standard, Israel shouldn't be a state, because what happened before Israel was formed, they ethnically cleansed hundreds of thousands of people, like deliberately. And, someone could argue that's not what happened. The Arab states invaded, Israel defended itself. Well, even by the time the Arab states invaded in 1948, Israel had ethnically cleansed, expelled hundreds of thousands of people. And if you read the work of Israeli historians like Benny Morris, you'll see that this was a deliberate policy because they wanted to clear out areas that they wanted to take. So by that standard, Israel shouldn't be a state. And the fact is, Palestinians, because they're occupied, have a right to resist. They don't have a right to kill civilians, but they do have the right to resist military occupation. And Hamas, as I talked about, I shouldn't say all of Hamas, some top members of Hamas had voiced support for accepting a Palestinian compromise of a two-state solution. It was Israel that rejected that. So the example here should be that it's Israel should learn that, when you don't accept even a major Palestinian compromise, and when you insist on denying them all their basic rights, when you impose on Gaza a criminal blockade, which was happening before October 7th, when you carry out routine massacres, you will face military resistance. And so we don't want to reward Israel by continuing to let it get away with that. And the way to resolve it would simply be let Palestinians finally have their own state. That's the way to resolve this whole thing, I think. And by the way, I'm in the minority in that position when it comes to people like in the pro-Palestine camp. Because if you're a Palestinian, how can you accept living next to the state anymore that just carried out a genocide, that is so openly supremacist, whose leaders talk about a new Nakba, all these things. It's hard for me to make the case to a Palestinian now to accept Israel. I still think, though, it's the only realistic solution possible. Ideally, to me, we shouldn't have ethno-supremacy. Palestinians should have the same rights as everybody else. But I don't think that's possible, unfortunately, because Israel has nuclear weapons. And I just don't think you're going to get that outcome. So I think the only thing plausible, in my opinion, is accepting the Palestinian compromise that Arab states and Iran and most Palestinian leaders have already accepted.
All right, so one final thing. When, with the Palestinian people, there have been reports that the Hamas built their weapon facilities under hospitals and schools. Do you believe the responsibility for that destruction and the civilian death lays with Hamas more than or completely compared to Israel?
Well, let's say it's true. I don't think that is true, but let's say it is true. Gaza's occupied. Occupiers don't have the right to self-defense against people they're occupying. They have obligations, and their obligation is to end the occupation. So if Hamas built weapons underneath a hospital, then that's not allowed under international law. Like, you can't use civilian facilities for that purpose. But Israel's not allowed to occupy it to begin with. And Israel, whatever Hamas is doing, should end the occupation. And if they end the occupation, I don't think you'd have Hamas doing things like that. Now, I don't think actually Hamas has used hospitals. There was a lot of talk about a Hamas command center under Al-Shifa Hospital. That's what Israeli and U.S. intelligence officials claimed. When they went there wasn't evidence for that. And there's some videos in which you actually see, I think, pretty clear evidence that Israel planted weapons inside the hospital to justify blowing it up. So to me, the foundational crime here, whatever Hamas has done, and again, I'm not a fan of Hamas. My friends in Gaza who live there, they don't like Hamas. So I'm not going to say anything positive about them in that respect. But they're not the primary actor here. It's the occupying power, and that's Israel.
Well, in 2006, I believe, Israel did relinquish control of the Gaza Strip.
They did. But then they also imposed a medieval siege in which they were even calculating how many calories the people of Gaza could live on without dying of starvation. And they formulated their policies accordingly. So they were going to let in just enough food so that Palestinians could survive without getting into full-blown starvation. So yes, Israel withdrew, and yes, they let Hamas take, and yes, Hamas took over, but Israel then imposed a criminal siege, leading even Israeli officials to call it a concentration camp, and that's what it was.
Great question, but we want to make sure.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. I appreciate it. As I've said earlier, it's so wonderful we can have debate, discussion, even if we disagree. That's what schools are for. And so I'm very happy to have different points of view. It would be too bad if everyone just agreed with me. So thank you for the critical questions.
Hello, thank you again for coming. My main question is, what in today's world is the viability of the two-state solution? I've heard about it over multiple years, heard different viability sources of how viable it is. But how viable is it if there were outside sources, like outside states, like the US, the UK, other sources putting their opinions in it? Or how viable is if no one else is involved and it's just Israel and Palestine?
If the U.S. said to Israel, hey, we're not going to keep giving you billions of dollars every single year, we're not going to keep vetoing UN Security Council resolutions for you, we're not going to keep fast-tracking weapons transfers to you unless you let Palestinians have their own state in a sliver of land, the West Bank and Gaza, I do think that would make a big shift. It would be different. Israel has gotten really more extreme. I lived there for a time in the 1990s, just like for about 9 months, and still then there was like a liberal constituency. There was some debate inside the country. There was hope at the time for a two-state solution. All that's pretty much gone now. Extremism is off the charts. The people in power are really, really extreme. And so it'd be tough. Israel would go through some hard times, but without U.S. support, Israel could not continue to carry out the occupation. And the viability simply would be Israel withdraws its settlers from the West Bank. They have no right to be there. It's a violation of the Geneva Conventions to move your population into occupied territory. And without the military guarding them, I don't think they would stay. And if they did, it would not turn out very well. And I just don't see any other alternative. I mean, the optimal alternative is equality for everybody and let Palestinians return to their homes. I'd love that. I don't think it's going to happen. That's why I think this is the only possible solution that I can see.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wenda, thank you for coming. I have two questions. I'll get right to the point. First, correct me if I'm wrong. It's my understanding that the Palestinian territory is made up of non-contiguous areas. So under a two-state solution, in your opinion, what would be a good way to reconcile that? Like if you're a Palestinian living in one of the non-contiguous areas and you would like to travel to another one, and maybe you don't feel comfortable traveling through Israel,
Yeah.
What would be in your opinion, a way to mitigate that?
You have to dismantle the major Israeli settlement blocks. Now, what Israel could do is say, listen, we want these settlements so badly that we're willing to give you an equal amount of land inside what is now Israel. But Israel's never done that. In previous negotiations, Israel has never offered Palestinians an equal land swap. So they've insisted that Israel retain the major settlement blocks, including Maté Abdumim, which basically cuts the West Bank in half, without even saying to Palestinians, we're going to give you an equal amount of land inside Israel. So how can Palestinians accept that? If you won't dismantle the major West Bank settlement blocks, which I think Israel should, because they're illegal, they have no right to be there, then at least offer Palestinians an equal amount of land. And there was talk about this in the 1990s about building a highway between the West Bank and Gaza. It's really impractical. It's so silly that you have like these two different Palestinian areas, and that's supposed to be the state, and then you have Israel in the middle. It's a mess, but unfortunately, this is the reality we have. We have to deal with what we have. So the key obstacle there, I think, getting to your question, is the settlements. That's the impediment to a contiguous Palestinian state, and they're built that way on purpose. There's a reason why they're built that way. They're built to swallow up all the valuable land, all the valuable water reserves, especially. So you have, if you go to the settlements, you'll see these lush places with pools and green lawns, and the Palestinian village next door doesn't even always have access to its own water, and people have to live with very little amounts of water a day, which is a lot better than in Gaza, where some areas have no water. So the major obstacle here is the settlements, and they could easily, I think, be dismantled if the U.S. changes policy, and if not, at least offer Palestinians something equal inside what is now Israel.
So essentially, there's no feasible, or at least no easily attainable way to make the territory seamless, you think?
Well, Gaza and the West Bank, no, because they're so far apart. I forgot how long it would take to drive there unimpeded, but it's at least, I don't know, I think 45 minutes. So, yeah, no. And then the West Bank, yes, if you dismantled the illegal Jewish settlements, absolutely. But, yeah, again, no Israeli government, even to the, even the labor governments of Yitzhak Rabin or Ehud Barak was ever willing to do that because of the power of the settler movement.
And my second question, completely unrelated. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, I've seen some people share the narrative that the war against Ukraine is, since Putin's getting up there in years, that this is essentially his chance at defining his legacy before he dies or retires, whichever comes first. So I wanted to know if you had any opinion on, after he leaves office, what you think whoever his successor is, if you think they might continue things, or if you think what we're seeing right now, this is just a Putin thing.
That's a great question. I don't know that much about Russian internal politics, to be honest with you. And I do think that Putin kind of snapped when he invaded. I think he thought this would be a lot easier than it was. I don't think he was expecting this prolonged warfare, and I don't think he was expecting Ukrainians to put up that much of a fight. So I do think this was uniquely Putin. I will say, though, what I know about Russia is I do think he has a base of support. His popularity ratings are pretty high. Now, you could argue it's an authoritarian state, you can't trust those, but from speaking to my Russian friends, actually, there's a real nationalist fervor right now. They do feel encircled by the West. They do see Ukraine as basically a U.S. proxy that's been used against them. And there still is, despite the heavy casualties, support for him. And so I expect whoever comes after him to continue those policies. And by the way, we should say, and I'm glad you raised this question, inside Russia, he's like a relative moderate. There are a lot more, hard-line right-wingers than Vladimir Putin inside the government who wanted him to invade Ukraine a lot earlier, and he didn't. I think because he was trying to give the Minsk peace process that I spent a lot of time talking about, he was trying to give that a chance. I didn't mention, by the way, that later on, after Russia invaded, the leaders of France and Germany, Merkel and Hollande, who were, helped broker the Minsk Accords back in February 2015, they claimed that actually Minsk was just a stalling tactic to give Ukraine time to build up its army to win a military victory to resolve the Donbass by force rather than through peace. I think they were just saying that. I think they were saying that because at the time the idea of diplomacy with Russia was considered appeasement. But that's what they said. And it just speaks to how hostile we've been inside NATO land to diplomacy. And I think if Trump is genuine about actually engaging in diplomacy, I'm a lot more optimistic than I am about the current situation when you have a lot of death and carnage for something that I think could be resolved if people were serious about negotiations.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. It was very insightful to hear your lecture. I'm wondering two things in regards to the Middle East. Something that goes through my head when I think about...
A little closer, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Something that goes through my head when I think about the Israeli-Palestine conflict is if it does come, I personally think there's no win-win situation here, but if it does come out that Palestine will get their homeland back, there's nowhere for the Jews to go. Arabs have 20 countries. We currently have one. So, where do you think that'll leave Jews or Israelis at the end, if that does happen?
I don't think that would happen because Israel's very powerful. They have nuclear weapons. So I don't see how what military force could compel them to leave. But look, more broadly, why should Palestinians have to pay the price of the European crimes against Jews? It wasn't Palestinians who murdered my great-grandparents. It was German Nazis. And Palestinians have been told you have to pay the price for that. And I just, I can't abide that. In terms of where Jews could go, theoretically, why not here? Why do we have to build a Jewish state in a land that was already populated by people and that necessitated their ethnic cleansing? And that now, to perpetuate what necessitates ethno-supremacy, in line with apartheid in South Africa. And to me, is that real? From particularly a Jewish perspective, if you're just, is that real security for Jews? Is Israel been a safe haven for Jews? Look at October 7th. This is the price of maintaining an ethno-supremacist state, is you're constantly violent, and you're constantly escalating your violence too to maintain your dominance. And I just don't think that's in anyone's interest, including Israeli Jews. So I don't think your scenario will ever actually be tested. I don't think Israel will ever have to leave. given their overwhelming military power. But if they did, honestly, anything to me is better than the current status quo, which is it's a recipe for everyone's destruction in the Middle East, because I just see Israel's constantly initiating aggression to maintain its dominance for a very long time now, and that's going to lead us to an even worse path than we're on right now.
I mean, in regards to what you said about like why not here, this goes into my second question. Why not here? Well, Jews don't feel safe here right now. Like, I mean, I was just talking to someone yesterday who was like, well, I took a class at John Jay, but I was kicked out because I'm Jewish. And she had to transfer because she's Jewish. So.
Well, then she, like anyone who feels that they've been the target of discrimination, they can lodge a complaint. Look, I'm Jewish. I feel very safe here. When you compare Jews to the rest of society in terms of opportunities and discrimination, I just don't think we rate as at the top of people who are suffering persecution and discrimination. I think that belongs to people of color, where there's a long history of that, and it's ongoing. It's systemic. I can't, if someone individually feels persecuted, I can't tell them that they're wrong, but I would ask them to look at themselves and consider who really is a victim of discrimination in this country. It's a touchy
would you say like people getting blocked, Jews, I'm Jewish, I mean, getting blocked from entering their universities through these protests are part of, well, look at yourself and like who's the victim? People are getting blocked into universities. There's anti-Semitic things all over.
In terms of like denied entry, like physically?
Denied entry physically into, I mean, Columbia, look at Columbia. People are denied entry into Columbia by students because they're Jewish. They look Jewish.
If my people were being genocided, mass murdered, then I would welcome students blocking other students to bring attention to that genocide. That's the problem here is, you might not agree with their perspective that it's genocide or my perspective, but that's how we feel it is. And so when you feel there's a genocide going on, you want to do something about it. That's what people are doing. I've been to these encampments. Now, obviously, I agree with them, so I'm biased, but I felt safe. And I saw people who have a conscience and are trying to stop a horrible atrocity. I have friends in Gaza living through things I can't even imagine. The stories I hear from them every day, and it's a miracle they're still alive. And it's very maddening. And so when you're angry about injustice and you're mad, and you're living in a society where the dominant narrative is actually supporting what you think is that injustice, you want to do something about it. And that's what I think these students are doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Hey there, I just want to say thank you for this lecture. It was very insightful and introspective. My question was for Ukraine. Why hasn't the United States done more to help them? If our primary goal was, as you said, to weaken Russia, why are we now turning around and saying to negotiate and surrender its land and statehood?
Well, I don't think that would happen if not for Donald Trump. That's a case where you have a singular figure who, for whatever reason, wants to get along with Russia. I think he identifies with Vladimir Putin. He likes the authoritarian aspect. There is, amongst the American right, sort of affinity for the Christian Orthodox nature of Russia. They see Russia as more in line with their values. And they see Ukraine also as a place of decadence, which is not even true because Ukraine's also very conservative, but whatever. For whatever reason, Trump wants to get along with Russia. And also, in his first term, he was falsely accused of being a Russian agent. He was basically framed by the Democrats of being involved in a sprawling conspiracy with Russia. I think he wants revenge on them. One of the ways he can take revenge is by making peace, which he was, prevented from doing in his first term. That's my guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. My question is, do you think NATO should still exist?
No, I do not. Because again, you can make an argument, I think, during the times of the Soviet Union that, okay, fair enough, you have this major bloc, why not have another one? But the Soviet Union's dead. So what is the threat that we're defending against now? And if you look at what NATO's done, I don't think has a very positive record. It destroyed Libya. Whatever you think of Gaddafi, attacking Libya and carrying out regime change has led to a very divided country where you have even competing governments now in Libya. I've actually lost track of how many governments claim to be the government of Libya now. It was like 2 or 3 the last time I checked. And there's been horrible atrocities. So that's NATO. And then there's Serbia, which is more complicated, but I don't think that was positive either. So yeah, I mean, weapons manufacturers make a lot of money off of NATO. That's why I mentioned earlier, the vice president of the main lobbying group for NATO expansion was also the head of the group lobbying for NATO expansion was the vice president of Lockheed Martin. So for them, it's great. For the rest of us, not so much.
Thank you.
Hi. In terms of the question that the Jewish person had asked earlier in the terms of like why not here and stuff like that, to which you had said like you as a Jewish man, you feel safe. Me as a black man in America, I don't really feel safe in this country.
Yeah.
So in terms of that, it's more or less how exactly are we going to put a group of ethnic people, right? Mostly white people in a country where they don't even want Native Americans here, who have been here longer. So how are you going to put a place where minorities in this country, in of itself, people who've ethnically and like who've been here way before, right? How are you going to put them? How does that really look, and how does that really work in terms of that? Because they're trying to kick out immigrants as is, and how are you going to put immigrants from Israel, and they're trying to.
I wasn't proposing that we move Israel to Long Island.
I know, but it's more or less
yeah.
like in the broader term, not in
Yeah. I was just saying is that, I don't believe in ethno-states. And by the way, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of a Jewish national home. I'm actually alive because of Zionists, because of someone who I really, politically, I disagree with, but a guy named Jabotinsky, who wrote about how we need Zionism to create Israel, but he said honestly, the Zionism is a colonizing adventure. He recognized that Arabs were in Palestine, and he proposed expelling them. But my family was saved because when the Nazis occupied Hungary, this was right after my father was born, and the Jews had to basically move into the Jewish ghetto and take refuge in something called the Glass House, which is a Swiss protected facility inside Budapest. And when my grandmother arrived at the Glass House with my father, who was an infant, there was no more room left. But because my great-grandfather was friends with this guy, the Zionist leader Jabotinsky, once they found out, my father and grandmother got a place inside the Glass House. So I'm alive, actually, because of Zionists. So I understand the need for the desire for a Jewish national home, especially in light of the Holocaust. But it shouldn't come at anyone else's expense. And that's why I was just casually saying, why not have the Jewish state here on Long Island? Like a lot of Jews here already, but obviously, we could have had a Jewish national home somewhere, just not in Palestine, where there already were people living and were expelled because they weren't of the ethnic group that wanted to take it over. That was my point.
Wow, what a great discussion. Thanks for all your good questions. And I'm supposed to... Also wanted to just mention that today at 3 p.m., Aaron is going to be on Judging Freedom, which is an online program. I think it's at 3, is that right, Marty? With Judge Napolitano. Am I correct?
Yes, but you've had enough of me today, so don't, this is plenty of me today, and I appreciate you all coming.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Aaron for another wonderful presentation.